In the gospel today, Jesus seems to be praising this dishonest steward who is supposed to be managing this wealthy employer's money and land, but he ends up, seems, taking advantage of his position, overcharging the master's tenants so that he can take in more of the proceeds. When the landowner discovers his dishonest practice, then he's fired from his job. So it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot to praise that steward in the gospel, especially if you happen to be an employer and would have someone do that to you. So what is the lesson that Jesus has for us? Well, before the news of this man's dismissal became public, this shrewd steward decided to strike a deal with the master's debtors, reducing the amount that they owed. In discounting them of their debts, he himself would have been giving up something of the commission he would have normally have received from them. But in doing that, he won the favor of those debtors, and at the same time made his employer look to be this generous and forgiving man toward those who owed him money. Surely everybody in the town would look at that landowner and say, what a great guy he is to forgive those debts that way. And since the master couldn't undo what this steward had promised everybody without making himself look bad, he even praises the steward for outwitting him and making him look kind and generous to everyone around. So to be clear, Jesus isn't praising the dishonesty of the steward, nor is he praising him for his trickery, but rather Jesus is pointing out the wisdom of seeking something more than just money or possessions. You see, the friendships, the connections that the steward is going to form through forgiving them of their debts will end up being to him much more valuable than any of that money he dishonestly took for himself. And the same is true for us, especially in terms of our eternity. That our relationships with others and with God will end up being much more valuable and lasting than any kind of earthly wealth we can accumulate. And so at the end of the gospel, Jesus says, no servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. And this word mammon is referring to this kind of money, possessions, worldly goods. So for Jesus, it's really a question for us as to what is it that controls our lives? What is it that is our ruler or our master? Is it money and possessions that kind of determine what we do? Or is it a trust in God as our master? Jesus, when he explains the Beatitudes, that's where he starts. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So this virtue of being poor in spirit doesn't necessarily mean we can't have things at all. I mean, we're not supposed to, or we don't have to live in just an absolute poverty. But poor in spirit has to do with not being attached to money, to possessions. St. Francis de Sales, he speaks about this virtue of poverty of spirit that we're all supposed to practice. And he says it's especially important if we happen to have riches, to have many things. Francis says that if you have riches, keep your heart free from attachment to them. And he uses an analogy to help us out. He says there's always a difference between keeping poison and being poisoned. So not that money is exactly poison, but his point is that we can keep maybe certain poisonous chemicals to help get rid of pests, but we don't actually consume those things. And so we're not poisoned by them. So he says, so too you can own riches without being poisoned by them. Such will be the case if you have them in your house or in your purse, but not in your heart. So it's okay to have all of our possessions and money, to use them for the good purposes that we need for our lives, our families, as long as we don't keep them contained so much in our heart that it really drives all we do. He says to be rich actually and poor in affection for riches is the great happiness of a Christian. St. Francis points out that it can be difficult for someone who might be attached to money or things to really recognize that that's going on. He says they can excuse themselves under the pretext of the care they need to have for their children, or the demands that they want to make sure they have enough resources to take care of things. But he says they never have too much. They always find the need to have more. And so he gives some signs that could help us recognize, do I have a certain kind of attachment in that area that's not healthy? He says if you desire long and ardently and anxiously for the goods that you do not have, or if you're occupied with the goods that you do have, that you set your heart upon them, that you concentrate your thoughts on them, that if you have this fear within you that you would ever lose them, then he says, believe me, you have some kind of fever caused by this poison of being so attached to money and possessions. But the good news is that once we recognize that we're attached to something, we can choose to let it go. You know, even this dishonest steward who was so attached to money that he was stealing from the master, even when he finally realizes that's not going to sustain me, it's going to all go away, he's able to attach himself to things that are more important, the people that will help him. Next weekend, Jesus is going to continue this kind of theme of for us to be poor in spirit with another parable. And so next week we'll also look at some more advice that St. Francis gives on how do we live out this poverty of spirit. Whether we might have riches or maybe we actually are poor. That in both circumstances we can be poor in spirit. Not being poisoned by an overwhelming desire to have things, but to live out of the happiness that is entrusting our lives to God as our master.